I am not the same for having seen the moon shine on the other side of the world. With these simple words, Mary Ann Rodmacher captures the essence of what it means to travel. Nothing brings me greater joy than setting out for an adventure to a new city, a new country, or a new world, and I doubt this will ever change. But though travel is my greatest passion, it has also presented me with the greatest challenges I have ever faced. Stepping into places unknown requires both courage and vulnerability because you risk having everything from your beliefs to your identities called into question. Never was this more clear to me than when I spent a semester abroad, circumnavigating the globe with the hopes of gaining a better understanding of global citizenship. I encountered people who viewed life through a similar lens as I did, and people with whom I couldn't disagree with more, but most commonly, people whose cultures and views fell across a vast spectrum of beliefs. But sometimes these beliefs collided directly with elements of my own self, complicating my quest to become a global citizen more than I had ever anticipated. Throughout the experience, I found myself returning to this question time and time again. When we travel, what happens when our desire to be a global citizen and our own identities come into conflict? I was fortunate enough to be raised in a family that understood the value of travel, and even more fortunate to have had opportunities to do so. I always knew I'd want to spend a semester overseas in college, but little did I know that I would end up spending the semester at sea as well. I stumbled across Semester at Sea, which offered students a chance to live aboard a ship and travel to multiple countries and continents in the span of just a few months. In preparation for my trip, I spent some time thinking about the concept of global citizenship. The idea of being a global citizen gets tossed around in higher education all the time, but is rarely defined. Scholars debate definitions and even whether it can be defined at all. He sees being a global citizen as being on an ongoing journey towards a better understanding of the world, but not a quest to belong everywhere or to call everywhere your own. This way of thinking seemed to make sense to me, as it recognized the elements of it being a process, but also acknowledged that global citizenship should not be used as a justification for foreigners to inappropriately involve themselves in other cultures or appropriate these cultures. Another writer, Truing White, writes about the active element of global citizenship. Transformative global citizenship, when achieving its full potential, comes not only with a desire to understand multiple perspectives, but also to offer a critical analysis. Do I have a right to offer a critical analysis of a culture that isn't mine? Wasn't the whole point of being a global citizen to be open-minded and not judged? Little did I know that I would soon find myself in several real-world situations that would require me to think hard about how to make sense of these concepts, and that my definition of global citizenship would change many times over the course of my journey. After months of planning and anticipation, embarkation day finally arrived. It would be 2 weeks at sea before we arrived in our first country, with only a brief stop to refuel along the way. Those 2 weeks were spent getting to know my fellow students, finding my way around the ship, and, of course, in class. The topic of global citizenship was brought up during the very first lectures. Our professors challenged us to strive to be a global citizen throughout our travels, but also to expect obstacles as we encountered cultures far from our own. They identified countries where people of color were more likely to be harassed, where women didn't have access to the same spaces as men, and even where it was illegal to be gay. For the first time, I began to understand the identity element of this concept. The next 10 days were spent at sea, with plenty of time to anticipate our arrival in our first foreign port, Japan. Class was spent learning about Asian culture, how it compared to the West, what was to be expected when we disembarked, and what would be expected of us. Though widespread cultural practices and beliefs were taught to us, little time was spent addressing what challenges students of minority statuses might encounter. My time in Japan seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, 5 days were up and it was time to return to the ship and sail to our next destination. Besides a bit of staring at my blonde hair and some extra glances our way when my friends and I got a bit too loud at dinner, I never experienced any discomfort for existing a certain way. Both of my excursion tour guides were women, we encountered religious diversity of all kinds, and friends of mine even attended a lecture at a local university about LGBT rights. This relatively high level of tolerance, we were told by some members of the staff, shouldn't be expected everywhere. The farther away we went from home, the more different the places we'd visit would be. Though these people weren't necessarily wrong, this anticipation of drastic differences felt a bit problematic, as if we were creating issues that hadn't even arisen yet. He also acknowledges this issue in attempts to teach about foreign culture, claiming that some global education practices tend to emphasize an awareness of distant others, therefore reinforcing a them versus us mentality at the expense of linking local and global challenges. Caution of othering was very much on my mind as I stood on the deck in the middle of the night and watched us pull into China, a place that one staff member had referred to as being strictly rooted in tradition, so much so that it prevents them from moving forward. I did indeed, however, feel farther from home than I had in Japan, but I wondered how much of this was simply in my head. While walking the streets of Shanghai, China, with two of my friends, we decided to duck into a small hole-in-the-wall bar. The bartender, Lucy, was overjoyed to have customers so late at night, and even more excited to hear that we were American. Somewhere in the conversation, one of my friends mentioned where I was from, and the bartender got excited, quickly pulling out a picture of several visitors from Florida who visited a few years back. While showing us the photo, she pointed to a guy in the center and told us, "And this one, he had a husband. He was gay." She followed this with, "We don't have gays in China very much because it's so different, and it's hard to understand. Well, what would you do if you knew someone who was gay like that?" After thinking for a moment and trying to come up with a way to put my passionate and personal connection into my statement, I finally said, the way I see it, if people are happy and love each other, it doesn't affect me. I want people to be able to do what makes them happy. She was really surprised at this, as if she'd expected me to toy with the idea and give a more mixed answer. My two friends said they felt the same way, and she was surprised at that too, but not surprised so much as in opposition. She told us that in China, there were not a lot of gay people, to her knowledge, mainly because China is so traditional in practices and values. But when she was talking, she wasn't speaking about it in a negative way, just very matter-of-factly. I could tell, even in a short conversation with her, that she simply couldn't place a concept like homosexuality, because nothing she had ever learned or been taught allowed for the possibility of things not falling into a category. Later in the conversation, she brought up gay couples adopting, and how she thinks it might be confusing for the kid, because they wouldn't know who the mother was and who was the father. Then would ask her which she thought was better, a child growing up in an orphanage and never knowing love, or being adopted by two men or two women who would give that child a family, opportunities, and love. To which she said she would obviously want a child to be loved, but she couldn't quite make sure of how it would all fit together. I walked away from the bar later that night, not frustrated by the conversation, but actually really optimistic. The fact that she was thinking actively about this concept and wanted to know our thoughts and was subconsciously juggling her own traditions with what her gut told her gave me a tremendous amount of hope for future generations, especially in cultures that may be seen as oppressive, but are perhaps just behind the times more than teaching their kids to oppress. After a week in China, I came to the conclusion that, for a culture so rooted in tradition, it seemed very full of people like Lucy, human beings like anywhere else who do not naturally see anyone as less than them. En route to Vietnam, our shipboard community played host to a few visitors from our upcoming port of Ho Chi Minh City, one of which was a student named Toby. I volunteered to take him to lunch one day while at sea, and he and I hit it off immediately. We had a common interest in social justice, travel, and cultural studies, and compared our backgrounds in these topics and how they've shaped our paths. As with Lucy, the conversation never felt forced or scripted. We just naturally found ourselves curious about each other's lives. Toby mentioned the fact that he and a group of friends had pioneered the first LGBT student group at his university. So later that night, I invited him to a meeting of our own semester at Sea LGBT Club. When he joined us, he took the time to tell of his own story of living as a gay man in Vietnam, and how it's been through the effort of his generation that times have begun to change and his culture has begun to emphasize the positives of differences. In his own words, diversity is something that you cannot avoid, so you should try and love your identity and that of others. Toby asked us about the types of conversations we have with our families, both in regards to LGBT rights and the changing times, and we found many similarities across our cultures. Before we adjourned for the evening, Toby began to tear up, saying, "From the moment I walked in, I knew that I had finally found my people here on the ship. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of what you all have here." I was feeling pretty good about my quest for global citizenship as we docked in Myanmar. So far, I had managed to make friends in new places, have conversations with people from all walks of life, and learn a tremendous amount about other cultures, all because of my desire to be a global citizen and to learn more about the world. So when I found myself outside of the entrance to a Buddhist temple, face to face with a sign that said, "Ladies do not enter," I was unprepared, to say the least. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that all the other women around me were accepting this restriction without question, not bothered by the fact that we had spent the same amount of money as our male counterparts to see this exhibit. As the boys in our group waltzed past the sign without a second look, and we ladies scattered around the courtyard to wait on them to complete their visit, my anger continued to build. Were our men really not bothered by the blatant oppression they had just witnessed? Would they have hesitated to enter if the sign had been forbidding the presence of a certain race instead of gender? But as I sat there, it occurred to me that I might be viewing the situation with the same one-dimensional perspective that I was taking issue with. Being mad is the easy way out of a conflict, and I knew better than to be reacting to a cultural difference with anger. There's always a story under the surface, and I would be committing the same discriminatory injustice if I took the sign at face value and made no effort to understand the culture behind it. To better understand the logic of this, I thought back to what I knew of Myanmar. I also reminded myself of Myanmar's recent history of trauma. It would make sense for the women of Myanmar to be so hesitant to protest traditional ways of living. The more I searched and was able to come up with reasons for this sign's existence, the more I felt shame for my initial reaction of anger. Nothing excuses oppression, but oftentimes history shines a light on its supposed logic. Plus, it was not my place to pass judgment on the surface of a culture that was not my own. Who was to say that these local women who adhered to the sign were not infuriated by it, or that the men were aware of their privilege, but not in positions where they felt they could stand up for equality? While at sea on the way to India, I reflected on this situation. Global citizenship seemed achievable when things were smooth sailing, so to speak, but when the waters got choppier and the feelings of oppression entered the scene, it became much more difficult to remain an objective observer. But I was on this trip to learn and not judge, and that's what I resolved to do. Our ship happened to be in India during the Hindu holiday of Holi. The program I was traveling with had arranged for us to celebrate at a local venue where we'd be able to participate in the festivities with other tourists and locals alike. Though the intimate nature of putting colored powder on others was used as an excuse by several strangers to touch us without our permission, I felt safe and overall had an amazing time with people from everywhere. Walking back to the hotel, a few locals were tossing color on those passing by. Our group was exclusively female, and when we walked past one store in particular, several middle-aged men grabbed fistfuls of powder and forcefully tried to smear them on us. Us girls looked at each other uncertainly, but didn't say or do anything other than quicken our pace. Realizing they had gotten away with their actions, the men did it again, this time even rougher than before. Still, none of us said anything, afraid that a reaction might lead to something worse than harassment. When they went to try and touch us again, one girl in our group finally pushed the hand of one of the men away and shouted, "Stop it!" The men were surprised at receiving backlash, but shrugged it off and returned to their shop. I hadn't said anything to these men when they were harassing us, out of fear of imposing. One of our lectures on India had talked about how common it was for women to be bothered on the streets, and that they don't have a lot of agency when it comes to their personal space. I didn't want to bring my cultural beliefs into a country that wasn't my own, and I was so focused on maintaining the global citizen mentality of not publicizing any objections I had to a practice. But what I failed to distinguish between was culture and behavior. Perhaps these kind of actions were more common or more accepted in Indian culture compared to my own, but just as I shouldn't have to tolerate them in my own, I shouldn't have to tolerate them elsewhere. Beliefs may not be universal, but I shouldn't have to devalue myself to better understand someone else's way of life. Again, my understanding of global citizenship shifted. I could strive to learn about a culture without letting members of that culture devalue an identity of mine, especially since this didn't represent the culture as a whole. After India, we left Asia behind and headed for Africa. A brief stop in the island country of Mauritius to refuel sparked shipboard discussions about American perspectives on the continent, as an alarming number of students only knew stereotypes and problematic media portrayals of the countries we were to visit. Our next stop was South Africa, a country whose people recognized the importance of intersectionality. Still healing from the scars of apartheid, everyone I talked to spoke not only of the past, but of taking their history and using it for a better future for all identities. Nelson Mandela, former revolutionary and South African president, spoke to the necessity for gender as well as racial equality, and I heard many people quote him, particularly the phrase, "Freedom cannot be achieved unless women have been emancipated from all forms of oppression." Ghana was trickier to navigate for me. The first thought in my head as I stepped off the ship was, I'm illegal here. Though a bit of an exaggeration, this wasn't wrong. In Ghana, LGBT identities were technically against the law and certainly not widely accepted. I wish I could say this caution of mine to exist was only an initial reaction, but that wasn't the case. In the first couple of days I was there, any positive interactions I had with a local were met with thoughts in the back of my mind, wondering if they would have treated me the same way had they known about this element of my identity. I found myself scrolling through social media on my phone when I passed by a homophobic post by a narrow-minded relative back home. I rolled my eyes and was about to continue when something occurred to me. Bigotry is everywhere. It exists at home no different than it exists abroad. Why was I living in anticipation of hate that may or may not come? Again, I felt shame for having grouped legislation and subsets of beliefs together with the culture as a whole. But unlike before, I didn't punish myself for my gut reaction, as I tried to look at my behavior through the same critical lens that I did of others. I had reason to have my guard up against prejudice. Where I went wrong was the anticipation, not the caution. My global citizen perspective shifted once more. Our final stop before heading for Europe at the end of our voyage was Morocco, the first and only predominantly Arabic nation we were to visit. I packed a scarf in my bag in case we were to go to any places of worship, and sure enough, it was one of our first stops. However, all our guide told us to do was to remove our shoes before going in, though I saw the rest of the women were covering their heads. When I asked him if this was something we should be doing, he replied, "It is expected of the locals because they know the customs. All we ask of foreigners is that they show modesty and respect. It is about intent and not knowledge." This perspective of his, which seemed to be agreed upon by many, both here in Morocco and in the previous countries we had visited, seemed to me the epitome of global citizenship. No doubt we stood out by not having our heads covered, just as we must have stood out in ports before. But the locals saw that we were trying to honor the way that things were done, and that was enough for them. Lucy was trying to understand diversity, and that was enough for me. Toby's peers were trying to wrap their minds around identity, and that was enough for him. We were making an effort to be part of a community bigger than our own, and that was what truly mattered. When I first set out on my journey, I thought being a global citizen meant adopting the ways of whatever culture I was currently immersed in, and attempting to see the world through the eyes of its people. Now I realize that it's far more complicated than that, but also far more simple. Global citizenship boils down to this: a desire to learn about the world. This doesn't require submission or the erasure of your core identities, it just requires an open mind and the ability to contextualize. My time on semester at sea was the most rewarding 100 days of my life. The places I saw, the people I met, and the stories I heard changed me as a person, and I can only hope to do them justice by continuing my ongoing quest to be the best global citizen I can be.